we see from the experience of implementing RED projects in the field, partnering with governments, be it in the frame of the UN RED program, be it in the frame of other bilateral agreements and other frameworks, that these national governance frameworks we are faced with in the countries, they need to be adapted to ensure that the Red Cross actions that really reach the ground effectively and efficiently are taking red and carbon issues into account. This brings that forest and land use policies, institutions, and the legal frameworks are adapted to it. And of course, in general, as I commented before, we have observed that the legal issues have been quite weak until today, but there is for sure a strong need, and that was the idea, by trying to cope with emerging issues in Forest Day, that we bring in this governance and legal perspective into the discussions. As it is a new emerging area, we have started with a gap analysis with several partners in order to focus on the drivers of deforestation and degradation, but as well on participatory governance. I'm very glad to observe that this discussion forum is the result of partnering. This is, in general, the driving force of the collaborative partnership on forest and of Forest Day. And like these discussion forums are always partnered with several institutions, and in this case, we have partnered with GLOBE, UFRO, and FAO, and I'm very glad that this has been achieved. And this discussion forum builds on a previous meeting that was held in the margins of COFO in the frame of the Third Global Week in late September in Rome, where there's a specific focus on RED Plus and legal issues. And we will have as well the presentation by Tina Vahanen on the main outcomes of that meeting today. We have an incredible, interesting list of keynote speakers and panelists, so that I think the discussions may be guided with very interesting contributions with high speakers. So you may allow me now to introduce the first keynote speaker, Barry Gardiner, which is Vice President of GLOBE International, one of the 3 organizations that are partnering this event, and a Member of Parliament of the United Kingdom. I would like to highlight that this panel is not only formed by researchers or by international organizations, we're having as well important parliamentarians, also later as you and as panelists. This is very important in this emergency policy science interface. And for sure, the governance issues need very much this policy science interface in which every partner contributes for the correspondent angle and may illuminate this emerging area of RED and governance. So I invite Barry to take the floor, and I look much forward to your contribution.
Governance frameworks for RED Plus. You guys really know how to create a catchy title for a seminar, don't you? I mean, governance frameworks for RED Plus. Really? I'm surprised that anyone has turned out to listen to this. So here's a new title. Why and how should politicians give a damn about forests? First the why, then the how. Why should we give a damn about forests? The answer is we shouldn't, at least not for their own sake. Most of us know nothing about forests. We're not biologists, we're not ecologists. We shouldn't pretend to have some expertise that we simply don't possess. We're elected not because we give a damn about forests, but because we give a damn about people and about justice. And the simple reason that we need to think about things like forests is that the well-being of the people that we represent happens to depend upon them. And let's admit it, we politicians have made a mistake. I'll say that again, because it's not very often that you'll hear a serving politician say that. We politicians have made a mistake. We've undervalued the resources that our natural environment provides, and we're now beginning to pay the price for that. In particular, we've undervalued the services that forests provide, and that underestimation of the value of forests means that our decisions have been inadequately informed. Note those words carefully. Inadequately informed. It's what we politicians say when we mean that our policies have been ignorant and stupid. And the result of that stupidity is not just the pollution of our atmosphere or our rivers. It's not just the loss of ecosystem services that our natural environment and forests in particular provide. The result of that stupidity is actually the loss of justice that we were elected to protect. And it is the real failure of our social contract. Okay. So, just another politician talking fancy words and theories. Let me try to explain. Our failure to properly value many of the services that forests provide means that there is a market failure. It makes sense for a private individual to cut down the forests on his or her land and to realize the value that we do ascribe to them by way of logs and timber, and for that private individual to ignore the greater loss of value from the ecosystem services that those forests were providing, but that we failed to ascribe a correct value to. Services such as soil stabilization, watershed protection, local climate regulation, habitat for pollinators, and so on. And the reason that it makes sense for the landowner to do this is because these other values do not accrue to him. They are benefits to the wider community that the private individual does not and cannot capture. So in failing to recognize the true value of forests, we have created a system of social injustice, where an individual is able to make a private gain at the cost of a much greater public loss. Simply, we failed to account for the true wealth of our natural capital. So that's the why. We got it wrong. Now, how do we get it right? The answer is by ascribing the correct value to forests, but unfortunately that just begs the question. And crucially, REDD+ can't do this by itself. REDD+ is just one of a number of tools that we need to use. It's a specific tool that's designed to combat that other great market failure, climate change. So far, it has largely been developed by governments who have been busy preparing national strategies that provide new institutional frameworks, intersectoral strategic programs, implementation phases, and subnational activities. And I've no doubt that that early emphasis was absolutely critical for creating a vision and a related set of goals for achieving REDD+. But we've now reached a point where we must turn those strategies into actions. And a key aspect of this is how we integrate those national strategies into countries' existing legal frameworks. National strategies tend to identify existing laws and regulations that need to be amended, or they describe legal inconsistencies that need to be fixed as part of addressing deforestation. Often, those will be about conflicting definitions of property rights, or sometimes about the way in which different authorities' powers overlap in a way that creates uncertainty about tenure and what rights such tenure confers. Taking these proposed amendments and turning them into real changes in law requires not just technical, but also political know-how. Each country has its own unique legislative process that is affected by the dynamic relationship between the executive and the legislative body. But the major legal reforms that are needed to move a new paradigm of low-carbon land use will, in most cases, require the approval of the broader legislature or parliament. Now, considering this, you may think, as I do, that it's strange that such a limited effort has been made so far to engage with legislators to develop their support for REDD+. If you want to pass legislation on REDD+, then the clue really is in the name. Legislators are called legislators for a reason. We pass laws. And without securing the support of legislators, it will be increasingly difficult to achieve the reforms that are so necessary to support REDD+. This was the rationale for creating the Globe Legislators for Forest Initiative, which I've chaired since it was launched last May. Not last May, actually a year ago last May. And that program works directly with legislators in Brazil, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Indonesia, and Mexico. And it aims to strengthen the role of Parliament in achieving the goals of REDD+. And I'm delighted to be joined on the panel today by 3 Globe legislators who each have an understanding of what REDD+ can deliver to their own country and who've begun to use their powers as legislators to support this work. Yesterday, we convened here in Doha the Globe International Forest Forum, 4 cross-party groups of legislators from 4 countries in this initiative. And we began to explore the progress they had made in their own national parliaments to support REDD+. We heard about Mexico becoming the first country to legislate in support of REDD+. We discussed Brazil's REDD+ law project that is currently under discussion by the Senate and Congress in Brasilia. We heard about the need for greater parliamentary engagement on REDD+ in Indonesia, and we heard about the Legislative Working Group on Forest Governance and REDD+ that members of Globe DRC established this September. But whilst a focus on the legislative role of parliaments may be the primary way that a national legislator can support REDD+, creating a strong legal framework is only the first step. Good legislation is worth nothing without good implementation. And that's why legislators must also use their powers of oversight and scrutiny to ensure that the laws are being properly implemented and enforced. Legislators have the responsibility to hold the executive to account. They can do this, of course, by speaking out in Parliament when they discover executive failure, but they can also be proactive in probing government delivery through the tabling of questions, the taking of evidence from the public, through commissions of inquiry or select committees on which they sit. This is an area where Globe International is carrying out further research in collaboration with the Overseas Development Institute to explore the formal mechanisms and opportunities for parliamentary oversight of forest conservation and management in these key countries as they progress this REDD+ work. Legislators can also support REDD+ goals through the national budget process. We need to ensure that sufficient climate-related forest funding is allocated to support the implementation of the REDD+ strategy. Often, the institutions responsible for managing countries' forest reserves have inadequate resources to effectively enforce the laws and address illegal activity. So parliamentary pressure to call for greater implementation capacity would support REDD+ goals as well. Legislators have the responsibility of representing their constituents. This is difficult to do if you don't consult them. For REDD+, it couldn't be more important that the views and concerns of forest communities are heard in national policy debates about addressing deforestation. So legislators who represent tropical forest constituencies must play an active role in both listening to the people who live in and around the forests and championing their cause in order to ensure that REDD+ delivers pro-poor development strategies. Yesterday, it was interesting to hear of the essential role that our colleagues from Mexico attributed to the process of formal public consultation in explaining why they had managed to achieve such unanimity of support around their REDD+ law. When you remember that they managed to pass this legislation in the 9 months leading up to a general election, when each of the parties in Mexico was competing and vying with each other, you will see just how important that consultation and that buy-in was. Our legislators have a unique set of functions, duties, powers, responsibilities, each of which, if applied correctly, can help make REDD+ an effective implement, not just in combating climate change, but in securing a more just society where a full and proper value is attributed to our natural environment, and where the social wealth that our forests represent is fairly divided with the people who are most intimately connected with their sustainable management. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. I would just like to say that it's very important that we are able in this endeavor that Forest Day has generated and other settings to include into our forest discussions new constituencies. So in that sense, we are very lucky that you have established this working group, INGLOBE, of parliamentarians for forest issues, because it's really a very important issue to mobilize this key constituency into the debate. I would just invite you to comment this example that we really the challenge, and REDD+ is a very potent global mechanism of payment of environmental services. Not only translates traditional legal mechanism for negative environmental effects, but focus on open new avenues for incentives for positive environmental services. That is the key challenge on natural resources. And in that sense, we work in a new area, and eventually we make it some unexpected negative by-effects if we just translate it from the pollution and other environmental activities. As the tier 1 of environmental policy was focusing on negative environmental effects. And when translated to natural resources and forests, this mechanism, we make it also some negative by-effects, because the key issue is here mobilizing the positive externalities related to forest management. We may go now to the second speaker, which is as well a very highly relevant speaker, Niels Ellis Koch, who is on one hand president of UFRO, and I think that he will bring the research perspective. We had one of a very committed and transparent elected parliamentarian speaking very frankly to us, Barry, on the challenges and the difficulties of bridging policy and forest. And now we have the policy perspective by Niels, and Niels is as well in the moment Dean of something like the Life Science Faculty of Denmark, the previous Royal Faculty of Agriculture, but he is also leading the research institutions in Denmark related to forest, agriculture, and life sciences. So we have really a very respected specialist in forest issues who will bring us now the scientific perspective in this debate. And then we will immediately move to Tina, which will report us on the main results of the Rome workshop, and then the further panelists to move forward. So please, Niels.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. Now, my title today is Governance Frameworks for REDD+, and I'm going to share with you some reflections on effectiveness and integration. So this will be the scientist's approach to what you just heard from the politicians, the why and the how. So the politicians really got forward to you the whole problem and how to solve it. I'm going to give the political scientist background for that. And I'm building on the network of UFRO, the global network for forest scientists all over the world, comprising 15,000 forest scientists in 700 member organizations representing more than 120 countries. And I'm going to give the acknowledgement in the end of my presentations to those political scientists that UFRO has drawn upon making these presentations. Here's the content of my presentation. REDD+, context, the policy motivations, the current approach, effectiveness of REDD+, transitions from what I call self-interest to norm generation, and how to come forward to an integrated REDD+ governance framework, and then the way forward. This is the 7th point that I'm going to cover in my 10 minutes allotted slot. REDD+ is a new market-based and so far voluntary, non-legally binding framework, as we all know. And by being so, it follows the general trend of economic efficient governance solutions. The new governance models, they are needed, and they seek to embrace in one way or the other complexity instead of simple solutions. Our experience gained from working with sustainable forest management and forest conservation must be used to establish more effective REDD+ mechanism. If you look upon the policy motivations as just presented to you by Barry Gardner, we have to understand them because this is important for designing and implementing effective governance frameworks. Our political science scholarships in UFRO identifies two main motivations why support for policy interventions occur. One you could call the self-interest, which is the logic of consequences. It's often short-term, it's often narrow. I think this was what was presented by Barry Gardner, like not well adequate information, and he also used some more strong word about this kind of decisions. And then you have what is built upon norm generation, the logic of appropriateness, where you collectively identify and you look for long-term governance solutions. What are the policy motivations in REDD+? The current focus of REDD+ is on carbon, mainly, and that reflects the motivations of self-interest, which is often a necessary first step to engage new actors in a new policy instrument. However, bolstering legitimacy and effectiveness of REDD+ in the long term requires a shift towards a more integrated governance framework based on a collectively identified norm. Currently, there are some safeguard approach because there's a broad recognition that there are often trade-offs between carbon and livelihoods, economic development, agriculture, biodiversity conservation, and equity. So the safeguard approach hopes to maintain this additional outcome while addressing carbon as a primary goal. As we heard in the plenary this morning by Will Steffen, we try to safeguard instead of looking for win-win options, looking for synergies. So the research also indicates that this safeguard approach does not achieve many of these additional values yet. We can do better. The way in which REDD+ is implemented will determine its social and economic impact. Evidence suggests that the inclusion of socio-economic objectives upfront will increase the likelihood of achieving carbon and biodiversity goals and hence the effectiveness of REDD+ activities. UFRO is just as this Forest Day 6 launching a new report made in the Global Forest Expert Panel, which UFRO is chairing as part of the CPF initiative, and we have that together with a policy brief, and here you can read much more about this, and we're going to present this just after lunch also and go more into detail with these discussions. Now, how do we then make a transition from self-interest to norm generation? It requires assessing factors to which support might occur. The self-interest is the logic of consequences, as mentioned before, and the norm generation, where you have the logic of appropriateness. So the transition from self-interest to norm generation from a multiple benefits perspective is necessary for REDD+ to be more effective and legitimate to a broader community. Current REDD+ safeguard approach is a useful intermediate step towards an integrated framework addressing multiple objectives. The integrated REDD+ framework seeks to integrate social and biodiversity objectives. It builds, as Barry Gardner put forward also, on stakeholder engagement that draws on a variety of motivations. It fosters stakeholder learning, and it allows adaptive policy development. It is based on a collectively identified norm. So our political scientists in UFRO believe that the way forward is that the ongoing work with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change offers the potential for policymakers to progress from safeguard approach towards a common understanding about an integrated framework for REDD+. Legal rules need to reflect and reinforce this common understanding to increase legitimacy and effectiveness by the following: pursuing social and biodiversity objectives as a prerequisite alongside carbon, clarifying the carbon tenure and benefit sharing provisions at country level, which is not the case today, fostering stakeholder participation, and offering flexibility to allow policy learning and development. I have to acknowledge for this presentation here, those researchers here who's done this work for UFRO, putting this together, and here's some of the basic literature that we have based this presentation on, and you can find that in my presentation. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Niels, for compiling this more than 100 pages study, which will be presented later today in such a short and intensive way, but we got the flavor of the main issues, and especially I would retain this issue instead of the negative approach of safeguards to a much more inclusive approach, and surely the 2015 discussions on the international arrangement on forests may help to avoid this negative approach into a much more inclusive approach where the win-win-win and the synergies that the keynote speaker this morning in the plenary highlighted could be full unlocked. I would invite now Tiina Vahanen to present the main outcomes of the workshop that was dealt on these issues with more time during the World Forest Week in Rome late September. For those who don't know her, it's difficult not to know her, but Tiina Vahanen is was senior forest officer, is now senior climate change officer, and in between she was key as deputy head of the UN REDD Secretariat for setting up the UN REDD process in Geneva. So I think she has really one of the persons that have a more deeper view and experience in REDD. So please, Tiina.
Eduardo, and thank you for that introduction. Barry, I'm also equally shocked about the title of this event. And then when you read forward on the brochure, it says REDD is so complex. Then you wonder like, oh my goodness, this is very difficult, this issue. And yet it is quite complex and it's new. And as Eduardo was saying, there's also a little bump on the road in the negotiations, but I would like to stay optimistic so far. It is a new issue and requires much more dialogue, sharing of experiences, and discussion how to move forward. The biggest thing, I think, what makes the difference with REDD instead of the traditional sustainable forest management or natural resources management is really the issues that the relevant stakeholders would eventually be able to benefit from the payments or other benefits that the reduced emissions would bring to them. And that to happen in reality, there must be significant changes in many countries in legal activities, in laws, regulations that enable those streams of either monetary benefits or other benefits to actually trickle down to the actual stakeholders on the ground. So therefore, consistent legal frameworks are really essential for the REDD implementation, not only for the implementation in itself, but also to include REDD in the broader development goals and development policies at the national level. And those policies also need to be in line with the human rights principles as well as the provisions of the multilateral environmental agreements, in particular UNFCCC, but also others. You, I'm sure, all know that a lot of focus in the past 2 years or 3 years has been on MRV, the MRV on monitoring of REDD. And yes, that is still one of the major issues that we need to tackle, but increasingly countries are now asking more support to tackle with the legal reforms and legal activities that they need to address to get the actual benefit sharing and payment structures in place. So recently the UN REDD program, together with the World Bank's Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, we conducted a country needs assessment, and in that country needs assessment, the issues on governance, including legal preparedness, were basically the top #1 priority for countries currently. So that is quite interesting, because had you done this questionnaire, this study 2 years ago, it was clearly at that time the MRV was the number one. Both are still, I mean, MRV is still very critical, but now the focus seems to be more on the governance and legal preparedness issues. And of course that the key issue in the legal preparedness, how do you integrate carbon rights under the actual legislation that already exists, including coordination and consultations with relevant stakeholders, and how to assign the carbon rights. From this workshop that Eduardo mentioned that was held a few months ago in conjunction with COFO, and another study that FAO together with partners conducted a while ago based on case studies from Mexico, Vietnam and Zambia, we kind of concluded or summarized two key issues that from the legal preparedness perspective are really crucial. First, and they are intertwined, first is how to address really the causes of deforestation and forest degradation, how to improve law enforcement and controls on agricultural development and logging also to slow deforestation. And I want to put emphasis on the agricultural measures because you know, surely you and me as foresters, we do know that agriculture expansions is by far the largest driver of deforestation. That may not be that well always understood in necessarily in the negotiations and not in all corners, but if you look at from the global perspective, that really is the agriculture expansion that is the main driver. And the second thing that it is related to the causes of deforestation and forest degradation is the land tenure and the ownership questions. Who owns the land, who owns the forest, and of course clearly associated, who then owns the carbon produced by the trees and the soil. And if you then go from there to the issues, what are the critical issues in terms of the legal matters that should address those two key questions? I've listed 5 key issues. First is the security of rights, and I would emphasize it is both the customary rights and the formal rights. As you know, forests are largely publicly owned. In most developing countries, they are 100% publicly owned, but their stewardship and they are managed based on customary laws. So therefore, it is really critical that actually there is a formal recognition of those customary laws and practices. That is not an easy task, but we have examples of a number of countries that are also already trying to proceed to that way. The second issue is, since RED is very cross-sectoral issues, it is not only about forest, it is largely about forest, but it is also about agriculture, it is also about the water issues and other issues, land use as large. So also the harmonization of legal matters across sectors and strengthening therefore the institutional coordination is essential. Then obviously key is, and this came also across in Neil's presentations, is the stakeholder and public participation, including participation of women and minorities in the decision making at all levels, from the local level to the national level. Talking about the local level, the decentralized mechanisms need to be in place that regulate the funding flows and management issues including the benefit distribution mechanism as well as conflict and grievance mechanisms. And last but not least, the 5th issue is that there seems to be a real need to start reforming the investment laws in the countries to enable to capture the eventual monetary benefits that the reduced emissions would allow. Or even before that actual RED implementation phase to allow and enable and to put in place an enabling environment to actually receive larger scale investment for sectoral transformation. I would just like to conclude in fact here that saying that obviously the carbon rights, the tenure issues, the drivers of deforestation, they're very intertwined, and there will be, I would imagine, fairly long but hopefully fruitful process in SABSTA, in UNFCCC, but also in other bodies, including the Collaborative Partnership Forest members and others that can help to shape and help contribute to these official dialogues in UNFCCC. FAO in particular is focusing on supporting countries in developing their capacity in many aspects of REDS, including the legal preparedness for RED plus readiness. And we, of course, work very closely with our collaborators in the UN RED program of UNDP and UNEP, and of course with GLOBE and other partners. I would stop with this, and thank you, Eduardo.
Thank you, Tina, for the overview. And if there's further issues you want to question, we will have then later the debate and the opportunities also for informal interactions during the lunch and the coffee break and the reception. I would just like to highlight in this legal area that with the environmental services or the positive externalities related to natural resources, we enter a totally empty area from legal perspective. We have had 20 centuries of Roman law that has consolidated in the national law regarding the more physical ownership of land, forest use, agricultural use, and so on. But we have nothing on that, and we need an urgent development of all the legal concepts around, be time thresholds, be responsibilities and accountability, be the issue of additionality that may be an issue that some may discuss if it is a logic or not. There are lots of juridical elements that we're used to when we're speaking about in forest and production of timber or in many other of the legal business in any normal activity, but not in environmental services. There's really a strong urgency, not only to work on the RED, but to establish the overall legal concepts that are consistent, and then we can apply it to RED, to water, and to other environmental services. Otherwise, we may get lots of problems. So we move then really to the panelist situation, because Tina was bridging between keynotes and that workshop and the panelists, and we will have 4 deputies of 4 countries. I think this is a huge opportunity, and I would like to invite them to consider 4 key questions that the organizer have identified for their contribution, plus the debate that will follow. The first would be, what are the key areas of legal reform that need to be addressed to support RED+? The second, what are the essential ingredients? And eventually some may get hungry with the ingredients at this time of the day. And who are the stakeholders in a successful RED+ legal reform program? What role can parliamentarians and governments play in supporting the effective, equitable, and efficient implementation of RED+? That would be the third. And the fourth and final, how can legal frameworks be linked to market-driven mechanisms at a country level? And I saw it also the market issue in Neil's presentation. As I know it's contingent, especially in the Andean countries, I would like to invite that to understand the market not as a very rigid stock exchange and have a formal discussion around this issue. It's a kind of a voluntary issue. Like in this moment, the transactions in RED are done between governments in a kind of a voluntary basis. Not that one is thinking and we get the discussions on this very formal market issue that may distract us from the substance we want to focus on, because I know this is a contingent issue that is still not solved under the climate change discussion. So I would present the first speaker, which is Monsieur Joseph Ipalaka. He's member of the National Assembly of the Democratic Republic of Congo. I recall this is a very important forest nation with 160 million hectares of forest, 70% of the forest of the Congo Basin, and the 4th or 5th forest nation in forest cover of the globe. So for sure the perspective from the DRC will be highly important to hear. So please, Monsieur le Député.
Merci de l'honneur que vous me faites. Ça me donne l'opportunité de Je disais, je remerciais les organisateurs pour l'opportunité qu'ils accordent à la République démocratique du Congo pour
I thank the organizers for giving the floor to the Republic of Congo.
s'adresser
Democratic
à cette
Republic.
auguste assemblée. La République démocratique du Congo, c'est un vaste pays
The Democratic Republic of Congo is a very large country
avec une population jeune à croissance rapide.
with a very strongly increasing population.
Elle regorge d'énormes ressources naturelles, renouvelables et non renouvelables.
With enormous renewable and non-renewable natural resources.
Dans les forêts qui recèlent une riche biodiversité.
In the forest, there is a huge biodiversity.
Il y a aussi les richesses minières, des hydrocarbures, un potentiel énergétique important et un réseau hydrographique important représentant 50% d'eau douce de l'Afrique.
And there is also mining and energy opportunities and representing
50% des réserves d'eau douce d'Afrique.
and 50% of the total reserves in Africa.
Mais ces richesses ne contribuent pas à la hauteur de leur importance au développement humain.
But those resources doesn't contribute to the overall development of the country.
À cause de la faiblesse de la gouvernance, pour des raisons que nous n'évoquerons pas ici. À cause de la faiblesse de la gouvernance, pour des raisons que nous n'évoquerons pas ici.
Due to the lack of good governance in the country that we will discuss here.
Conscient des enjeux que représentent ces richesses pour le développement durable et propre, conscient des enjeux que représentent ces richesses pour un développement durable et propre du pays,
So very conscious about the richness and what it can contribute to the overall development of the country.
le gouvernement s'est engagé dans le processus RED, plus considéré à juste titre comme une stratégie de développement propre.
So the government is highly engaged in the RED Plus process and sustainable development.
En effet, la RDC a déjà fait valider son plan de préparation depuis 2010.
The preparation plan, the RPP of the Democratic Republic of Congo has been approved in 2010 already.
Et celui d'investissement en 2011, le plan d'investissement.
And the forest investment plan in 2011.
Et si la RDC est retenue parmi les 8 pays pilotes pour le programme d'investissement pour les forêts.
And the Democratic Republic has become one of the 8 countries that is selecting for the forest investment program, the FIP.
Sa stratégie nationale sera exposée par le ministre de l'Environnement au cours de ces assises.
And the strategy will be presented by the Environment Minister in the next couple of days.
Pour atteindre les objectifs de la RED+, le pays a besoin de reformer son cadre institutionnel ainsi que le cadre légal.
And to achieve the objectives of RED+, the country needs to reform its institutional and legal framework.
Le cadre institutionnel de la préparation du processus RED a été mis en place par un décret.
The institutional framework for the implementation of RED+ has been put in place by a decree,
Tandis que le cadre législatif existant nécessite une harmonisation et une réforme en vue d'y intégrer tous les aspects inhérents à l'aboutissement de la RED. je reprends. Le cadre législatif qui existe nécessite une harmonisation et une réforme en vue d'y intégrer tous les aspects inhérents à l'aboutissement du processus RED.
So the current legal framework needs to be reformed in order to harmonize and integrate all the relevant aspects to achieve the objectives of RED+.
Il s'agit notamment des lois relatives à la gestion et à l'utilisation de l'espace, c'est-à-dire la loi foncière pour la tenure foncière et forestière.
It's mainly about legislation linked to territory and space, I think. He was referring to land tenure legislation related to land tenure.
Et les autres lois comme la loi forestière, minière,
And the forest
qui ont
codes,
besoin de l'espace aussi.
the forest code, that needs space as well.
Et le pays doit se doter d'un cadre définissant un plan d'aménagement du territoire pour une affectation judicieuse des terres seront leur vocation prioritaire. Donc un plan d'aménagement pour une affectation judicieuse des terres,
Yeah.
selon leur vocation.
So the government is working on a land use planning to
Affectation des terres selon leur vocation prioritaire.
yeah, is working on a land use planning. Depending on different allocations.
Land use. Land use.
We're changing interpreters because it's not my. Okay, we'll do it together.
Yeah, I think it's, DRC is trying to improve their law so that they can come up with some coordinated land use, and so that various uses like mining, forestry can be allocated appropriately.
Ok. Le cadre légal doit prendre aussi en compte les aspects liés à la participation publique,
The legal aspect will have to take into consideration participatory approach of various stakeholders of this issue.
le partage des revenus issus de l'arrêt de plus,
Benefit sharing from RED Plus,
les sauvegardes nationales, sociales et environnementales,
and safeguard environmental and social,
le système MRV,
and the MRV.
et enfin, il faut s'assurer de l'application correcte de lois.
And the full implementation of existing law.
On a beaucoup de choses à dire, mais le temps nous est imparti. Je crois qu'il est dépassé. Nous nous arrêtons
Thank
là
you for the time.
et nous vous remercions.
We will follow then with Mr. Marcio Macedo, who is president of the Permanent Mixed Climate Change Commission of the Brazilian Chamber of Deputies. So, please, Señor Macedo.
Bom dia a todas as senhoras, senhores aqui presentes. Cumprimento os organizadores desse importante evento e os meus colegas de mesa neste debate.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to congratulate the organizers of this event and people present in this important debate.
nesses 5 minutos de tempo que tenho, abordarei 3 ações importantes, no meu entendimento, que acontecem no Brasil neste momento,
So in the 5 minutes,
sobre a governança de florestas e as políticas de mudanças climáticas.
in the 5 minutes I have, I will deal with 3 key issues related to forest governance and climate change, in my understanding.
Primeiro é a consolidação da gestão de florestas brasileiras com processo de institucionalização e endereço oficial que trata do assunto.
So the first one is the consolidation of governance in Brazil and the institutionalization of this subject in the country.
E as ações do governo brasileiro de combate à principal contribuição para a emissão de gases de efeito estufa, que é a mudança na terra e nas florestas, que tem como produto as queimadas e o desmatamento.
And the actions of the Brazilian government to deal with the key driver of climate change in the country, which is land use and forest fires.
As notícias dessa última semana do governo brasileiro e dos institutos de pesquisa são boas novas.
News from the Brazilian government and the research institutes are very positive from the past couple of weeks.
É o menor desmatamento da história do Brasil desde quando começou a medição em 1998.
We've had the smallest level of deforestation in the country ever since measuring started in 1998.
O ano de 2012, a redução de 27% em relação ao período anterior.
So in 2012, we had a reduction of 27% with regard to the previous period.
80% inferior ao pico de 2004.
80% below the 2004 peak.
Em relação às metas voluntárias que o Brasil assumiu de 36% a 38% até 2020,
With regard to the voluntary emission reduction targets that Brazil has, from 36% to 38%,
os dados do Instituto de Pesquisa
Reduction.
do Governo mostram que nós já atingimos 30,4%. Se levar em consideração a nossa meta máxima de 38%, 8 anos antes de 2020, o Brasil já atingiu aproximadamente 80% das suas metas voluntárias.
so Brazil has achieved a 30% reduction. And if you compare with the voluntary emission reduction targets of 38% by 2020, Brazil has achieved an 80% reduction 8 years prior to the target.
De 2005 a 2010, o Brasil retirou a emissão de 2,2 bilhões de toneladas de gás carbônicos, com a redução do desmatamento.
De 2005.
A 2010.
So from 2005 to 2010, Brazil has reduced 2.2 billion tons of carbon dioxide emissions.
De 2006 para cá, nós reduzimos as emissões de CO2 em 50%.
From 2006 to present, we've reduced CO2 emissions by 50%.
Então, certamente, se o governo brasileiro continuar nesse diapasão, nós, ao final de 2020, cumpriremos as nossas metas voluntárias.
So if the government continues in this route, we'll surely have achieved our voluntary targets by 2020.
O segundo ponto importante que eu considero é a ação parlamentar brasileira em relação aos projetos que estão em tramitação hoje na Câmara e no Senado Federal. Nós somos uma república federativa bicameral. Então, tem 2 projetos tramitando de RED+, na Câmara e outro no Senado Federal.
So the second point I'd emphasize is the legislative action. In Brazil, we have RED Plus law projects under consideration by both houses of Congress. We are bicameral Congress, so the Senate and the Chamber of Deputies.
Tem processo de construção de consenso das lideranças partidárias nas 2 casas e o diálogo com o governo brasileiro, que nós possamos, no futuro próximo, aprovar o arcabouço legal do Brasil sobre RED+.
there's a consensus building process among the leaderships of both houses of Congress as well as with the government with the view of passing legal frameworks for REDD+ very soon.
Eu penso que é fundamental para o nosso país que nós possamos aprovar os dois projetos de REDD+, mais o projeto de pagamento por serviço ambiental, para que o Brasil possa ter um arcabouço jurídico para orientar as políticas públicas do nosso governo.
I think it is fundamental that we approve these two REDD+ projects, as well as a project on payments for environmental services, in order to guide our government public policies.
Esse é o desafio do Parlamento do Brasil.
And this is the challenge of the Brazilian Congress.
A terceira, para concluir, gostaria de dizer também que tem no Brasil dois segmentos que cumprem um papel importante: o movimento social e os setores de pesquisas e acadêmicos do país.
And the third point to conclude, I'd like to say that there are two stakeholder groups that are very important in Brazil: social movement and research groups.
Primeiro, para garantir o debate livre e democrático e promover a fiscalização dos entes públicos.
The first one, social movements, to guarantee that debate exists and to scrutinize public bodies.
Registro algumas publicações recentes de movimentos importantes do Brasil que sinalizam, mesmo fazendo críticas, a que o Brasil está no caminho certo para cumprir as suas metas voluntárias.
And there are many public publications from these movements that, although being critical, indicate that Brazil is in the right pace.
E o segundo, que promove de forma científica e respeitável iniciativas para que possa ajudar ao governo a cumprir a sua governança de floresta e as suas metas na política de mudanças climáticas.
And the second group, through science, helps the government to design policies that will help it achieve its climate change targets.
Muito obrigado a todos.
Thank you very much.
Obrigado, señor diputado. We will follow now by Congresswoman María Isabel Ortiz Mantilla. She is Secretary of the Commission of Environment and Natural Resources of the Mexican Chamber of Deputies. So, por favor.
Reducir el tamaño. Antes que nada, quiero agradecer la oportunidad de estar aquí y de poder compartirles el trabajo legislativo que hemos realizado en México para impulsar el ir implementando REDD+ y además el promover un manejo forestal sustentable, un manejo forestal comunitario.
First of all, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to be here and share our experience in terms of the legislative work we have been performing in Mexico to support the implementation of REDD+ and promote sustainable community forest management.
The next, please.
Next slide. Please.
Permítanme empezar presentándoles lo que hemos logrado en México y, bueno, específicamente a través de la iniciativa forestal de legisladores Globe México hemos logrado. El año pasado, a través de una consulta muy extensa donde participaron diferentes sectores del gobierno, especialistas, sociedad civil, se lograron varias reformas que al final de cuentas se lograron ver reflejadas a través de una ley que verdaderamente podrá impulsar la implementación de REDD+.
Let me start by saying what Mexico and specifically Globe Mexico's Forest Initiative has accomplished. Last year, as a result of an inclusive process of consultation with relevant stakeholders, including government officers, civil society, and forest specialists, a set of legal reforms were developed and successfully transformed into law to support the implementation of REDD+ in Mexico.
The next, please. Estas reformas se enfocaron de manera fundamental en ir armonizando definiciones de degradación, deforestación, el concepto de servicios ambientales, pero también de ir instrumentando verdaderamente de manera concreta instrumentos en materia económica que beneficien a los dueños, ya hablaban hace un ratito sobre el tema de la tierra, a los dueños y poder pues, impulsar que los legítimos poseedores de los bosques sean quienes reciban los beneficios económicos y también incluir el concepto de salvaguardas. Algo que nos parece muy importante fue lograr pues, instruir al Poder Ejecutivo para que establezca en un plazo no mayor a 3 años un sistema nacional de monitoreo, reporte y verificación para evaluar y sistematizar la reducción de emisiones derivadas de las acciones para prevenir la deforestación y la degradación forestal, y esto va a ser en un periodo no mayor a 3 años.
These reforms focus on harmonizing the definitions of key terms such as deforestation, degradation, and environmental services, the development of economic instruments that benefit forest owners and forest land users, and the inclusion of REDD+ safeguards. They urge also the executive power to establish, in a period no longer than 3 years, a national system for monitoring, register, and verification to evaluate and systematize emission reductions derived from actions to prevent deforestation and forest degradation.
Estas reformas se hicieron de manera simultánea con la Estrategia Nacional de REDD+. Lo que se buscaba era reforzar esta estrategia, pero al final de cuentas las reformas fueron mucho más rápidas en el Congreso y fueron impulsando que esta estrategia se llevara a cabo pues, lo más rápido posible, que pudiéramos cumplir los compromisos que hicimos en Cancún, los compromisos internacionales que se realizaron como país, y bueno, pues esto fue bastante importante para México. The next slide, please.
These reforms came at a moment when Mexico's national REDD strategy was being drafted and had the objective of supporting the national effort toward this end. The idea was to go hand in hand with the development of the strategy. However, as matters turn out, the amendments advanced faster, so the achievement in Congress provided an important step forward in our country's effort to comply with international commitments established in the Cancún agreements.
Otro logro legislativo muy importante del cual estamos orgullosos es la Ley General de Cambio Climático, que fue aprobada en junio pasado. Como varios de ustedes saben, en México pues, se logró también que se reflejara en esta ley el objetivo de reducir las emisiones nacionales de gases de efecto invernadero en un 30% para el 2020, pero también se estableció el objetivo de alcanzar una tasa cero de pérdida de carbono en ecosistemas forestales originales también para el 2020.
Another major legislative accomplishment in Mexico was the approval last June of the General Law on Climate Change, which, among others, established the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 30% to 2020, below business as usual levels, and sets the goal of achieving a 0% rate of carbon loss in original forest ecosystems by 2020.
Por lo tanto, en México, el trabajo legislativo verdaderamente ha contribuido a la implementación de REDD+, a la promoción del manejo forestal comunitario y a la protección de comunidades y pueblos indígenas. Y quedó claro, y hay una muestra concreta, ya lo mencionó Barry, que se pueden llegar a acuerdos independientemente de participar en diferentes grupos políticos, en diferentes partidos. Cuando enfrente está el desarrollo sustentable, el trabajar por la integridad de las próximas generaciones, lo más importante es impulsar estas leyes.
In Mexico, legislative work has contributed to the implementation of REDD+, the promotion of community forest management and the protection of communities and indigenous peoples. This work has shown that it is possible to reach agreements between different positions, in this case political parties, when dealing with sustainable development and protecting the welfare and integrity of future generations.
Change, please. Este trabajo no fue improvisado, verdaderamente incluyó procesos inclusivos de transparencia. La participación de la sociedad civil fue fundamental para lograr estos acuerdos, para que verdaderamente se lograra la aprobación de la ley y estas reformas. Por lo tanto, el trabajo legislativo pues, fue a través de consultas, de participación de actores relevantes en estos temas, y fue un proceso nacional para lograr verdaderamente ir impulsando el que Red Plus se fuera implementando en México.
This work was not improvised. It was achieved through the establishment of transparent and inclusive process. Civil society's participation was crucial. This legislative work came as a result of a consultation process with relevant stakeholders. It was a work carried out to support the national efforts for the implementation of Mexico's National Red Strategy.
The next, please. Todavía hay mucho por hacer, no se ha logrado todo. Efectivamente, tendremos que estar verdaderamente supervisando y fiscalizando la aplicación y la implementación efectiva de esta ley. Tendremos que seguir haciendo reformas que permitan ir armonizando los diferentes conceptos, pero sin embargo, este es un claro ejemplo que los esfuerzos nacionales pueden verdaderamente pues servir como ejemplos también a las negociaciones internacionales. Estaríamos invitando a que tomen estos ejemplos para que las negociaciones internacionales se lleven a cabo independientemente de manejos diferentes de intereses. Thank you very much.
Much still needs to be done, including legislative oversight and parliamentary scrutiny toward an effective implementation of the law. Additional reforms are needed too, but these achievements have served to show that national efforts can serve as examples for international negotiations. Thank you.
Te faltó el muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, señora diputada. As you have heard before from Tina, in most of developing countries, forests do not belong to local community, but I would like to highlight that Mexico is a paradigm. For the last 90 years, 3/4 of the Mexican forests belong, not only are managed, but belong to the local communities. In that sense, the experience of Mexico is very important, like as well the commitment and forest issues have received in the past years. I would like also to highlight the way the panel has been selected. We have the second most important forest country, that was Brazil. The two countries that have had more problems of deforestation, not in relative, but in absolute terms, that were Brazil and Indonesia, which will be the following speaker. And we have the most important African forest country, DRC. I think this is a very adequate selection of countries, and we are very glad to have a keynote speaker from them. So may I introduce the last speaker, which is Mr. Mas Ahmad Santosa. He's the head and legal review and law enforcement working group for the Indonesian Red Plus Task Force. So please, Mr. Santosa.
Thank you, Eduardo. Distinguished speakers, panelists, and participants, let me share briefly to you about key legal challenges facing Red Plus in Indonesia. Some issues related to forest governance identified in the level of forest management planning, implementation, and enforcement. Among others, the existence two different legitimate legal bases to refer state forest areas between forest consensus map and regional spatial planning. Second, incomplete demarcation of forest boundaries. Number three, outlaw permits granting and transgression of obligation by business actors. Minimum access for community to utilize state forest areas for their livelihood. Corruption in granting concession process. Limited quantity, capacity, and capability of forest rangers and police to be able to detect the violation. And limitation of prosecution, which only focus on forestry legal regime and to ignore the potential use of other legal regimes such as environmental protection, spatial planning, money laundering, tax and anti-corruption legal regimes. The RED Plus program framework in Indonesia based on national strategy on RED Plus, which consists of 5 strategic pillars, which is interrelated, namely institutions and processes, legal and regulatory framework, strategic programs, changes to work paradigm and culture, and inclusion or involvement of stakeholders. Programs related to second pillar on legal and regulatory framework as identified in National Strategy on RED Plus, which is the focus of my presentation. Namely, 1, review land rights which aim to support tenurial certainty for masyarakat adat or indigenous peoples and local communities. The RED Plus can only give the benefit for the most marginalized people if it is able to support legal recognition and protection of indigenous people and local community. The genuine recognition and protection of indigenous people will lead to tenurial certainty. It then contributes to the assurance of fair distribution of benefit of RED Plus, primarily fairness and accountability for indigenous people and local communities whose lives and rights will be affected by RED Plus activity. Number 2, review and revise the legal framework relating to incentives for regions. Number 3, review the legal framework and incentives or disincentive for private sector. Number 4, establish a legal framework for the synchronization of data and spatial planning maps for issuing permits. Number 5, accelerate the establishment of spatial planning. Number 6, ensure compliance of the 2-year moratorium of a new permits for the conversion of forest and peatland. Number 7, improve law enforcement and prevent corruption in the natural resources management, particularly forest and peatland management. Despite the need of legislation harmonization, legislation improvement, and legislation existence, in principles, the existing legal frameworks have given mandates for reducing emission from deforestation and forest degradation, conservation and forest carbon stocks, enhancement of forest carbon stocks, and sustainable management of forests. However, the implementation is seldom lacking. In conclusion, the legal governance to support RED Plus requires, first, improvement of the existing framework. Second, capacity to implement the existing legal framework. Third, empowering law enforcement to promote optimal compliance. Number 4, improvement of horizontal as well as vertical coordination among governments. When it comes to enforcement, we need to ensure all relevant enforcement agencies have to be hand in hand to have optimal ability to detect the violation, to respond swift and surely, and to punish perpetrators indiscriminatively. Indonesia is currently working on what we call one coordination enforcement mechanisms, or one roof enforcement mechanism, which is temporarily facilitated by RED Plus Task Force, which was established by President, with predetermined and clear targeted cases by using multi-door approach. In the same time, the Supreme Court is developing Green Bench by allowing only certified judges to handle environmental and natural resources management related cases. The Special Green Task Force is also established in Attorney General's Office and CID, Criminal Investigation Department in the National Police. The role of our RED Plus Task Force in promoting effective enforcement is to assure 3 things. The coordination among enforcement agencies work well, the multi-door approach is used whenever relevant, and the process is accountable and free from corruption. To conclude my statement, there are huge challenges ahead in assuring adequate legal framework, effective implementation, and enforcement to support the readiness and implementation of REDD+. The executive branch of government cannot be alone in confronting the challenges. We need to broaden our support, particularly from lawmakers and civil society, including media. The establishment of Green Economy Caucus in Indonesia Parliament is one step to build and broaden the alliance for REDD+ beyond forests and beyond carbon, as it is our REDD+ tagline in Indonesia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Santosa. We have run out of time, but I imagine the contributions from all the panelists and the keynote speakers devote the time, so we might eventually erode a few minutes of the lunch break. And in order to better time management of the remaining time, I would propose that we capture 3-4 questions or comments. Please be very short, present yourself, and try to bring the issue as short as possible. And we will gather these 3 or 4 issues and then share it with whoever is the best addressed member of the panel. And then we would go to the rapporteur of the session. So please, who breaks the ice?
Thank you very much for this opportunity. My name is Muhammad Farid from National Council on Climate Change, Indonesia National Council on Climate Change. I would thank all of the speakers because today we got a lot of lessons learned how we will develop governance matters in relation with REDD implementation. From the presenter, I got a lot of modalities in relation with REDD governance. With regard on that, it seems we need to do revolution of the bureaucracy reformation. So it will need a comprehensive program in pace of enabling condition in each country that would like to implement the REDD program. I would like to know what will be most challenge in relation with develop the governance of REDD. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Some other contributions? I see one there and one in the middle. So if we could get these 3 ones consecutive, and then we go to the answers from the podium.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Ghanashyam Pandey from Nepal. I work with Okay, thank you.
Yeah, can you do it first loud? I will.
So, thank you. I think I would start from the Nils point that you have raised. The one point on REDD is initiated or led by the market mechanism. I have a little bit doubt and very sometimes skeptical in terms of the community perspectives. You know, the market mechanism is not success everywhere. So still in the REDD+ mechanism, it is not defined that how REDD+ mechanism will work. So would you elaborate a little bit that how this the market mechanism on RED Plus can ensure the rights of the local communities or indigenous peoples in the forest resources or on the carbon rights? So that's one point. And Tina, you mentioned that the tenure reform is the fundamental for the success of RED. My question to you that how UN RED facilitate those countries most does not recognize the community property rights. So how do you ensure or how do you put the minimum conditionality for those countries who wants to implement the RED Plus? They should have to have a legal mechanism to recognize the rights of indigenous or communities on their forests and carbons. Thank you.
Thank you. There were two further questions.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Jane Brickran. I come from Ghana, and I'm working with the IED on RED Plus. My question is for lawyers, and the question is about legal drafting. Just want to ask, must legal drafting be the monopoly of lawyers? Because usually maybe in so many countries, including mine, all stakeholders can talk, but eventually you leave everything to the lawyers to draft the law. And usually when the output comes, there are always loopholes. They say, hey, you cannot go back. And you have a lot of rigidity and regimental approaches that you cannot handle. How do the lawyers feel about this? Is there any global approach that can make this thing a bit feasible so that not only lawyers can have the monopoly for drafting laws? Thank you.
Please.
Thank you very much. Very interesting event. My name is Simona Lovera from Global Forest Coalition and Sobre Viventia, Paraguay. What I miss a little bit is the connection to the negotiations. And some things even seem quite disconnected. I mean, here they're talking about an enabling environment for RED investments. In the other side of town, they're talking about a finance abyss. I mean, this fast-track finance has not arrived for RED or anything else. The first 2 years, they're saying, from now on, the Green Climate Fund, which is supposed to be the main funding of public RED funding, main source of public RED funding, will not be operational. There will not be funding for the coming years, no commitments whatsoever. And carbon markets will not be operational 2020 at the very, very earliest. That's the very most optimistic scenario. And the reality is probably harsher. So, and moreover, EU has just proposed to basically exclude all middle-income countries from RED+. That includes 3 of the 4 countries presented here. Basically, the entire Latin America, Indonesia perhaps. So my question is actually, what do the parliamentarians here think of the EU proposal to exclude all middle-income countries from RED+ financing? And the second question, I was very much want to congratulate both Mexico and Brazil on the fantastic achievements until now. And I know that especially Mexico has not received a penny of RED funding yet. Doesn't that actually show that RED is not needed? And, you know, she said this is what we can do for RED, but wasn't it supposed to be RED doing something for countries?
Thank you. There was a fifth, and this will be the last question. If you could move forward.
Monsieur Olongo Pongo Basile, je suis honorable député de la République démocratique du Congo. Ma question s'adresse à l'honorable Barry. Le constat qu'on a fait est que ça n'évolue pas très bien, les programmes de RED+, un peu lentement. Ne trouvez-vous pas que le mécanisme utilisé pour la réduction des émissions dues à la déforestation et à la dégradation ne rencontre pas les besoins de la population autochtone? Même si nous changeons de loi, nous faisons des lois pratiquement dans tous les pays, les mécanismes utilisés ne rencontrent pas les besoins de la population autochtone locale. Ne doit-on changer la vision de faire pour que les choses aillent un peu vite? C'est ça ma question. Merci.
C'est l'honorable du Congo qui pose la question à l'honorable B. Sorry. The honorable from DRC is directing a question to Barry, Honorable Barry, and want to say that their own observation from DRC is that the Red Plus program is very slow. And what they have observed is that it doesn't seem to really link with the basic needs of the communities. Even if we implement in so many countries and so on, there's still this gap between the two. So is there anything to make sure that the need of the basic need of local community are integrated into Red Plus program?
Thank you. I would invite keynote speakers and panelists to try to answer the five comments that were brought forward, so eventually in that order.
Shall I respond in my summing up, if you want me to do the summing up?
Then eventually we start opposite, so that you can then include also your summaries. Please. Yes, let's start this way.
In responding to my colleague question, actually, Mas Farid, I think it is important that in one country, if we want to implement RED+, the bureaucratic reform and promoting clean and, effective government is very important. So like in Indonesia, I think if the bureaucratic reform doesn't work, and then I'm not so sure the the implementation of RED+ will be effective. So I agree with Farid's statement. Thank you.
Thank you.
Please, the microphone. Para responder las tres primeras preguntas, de alguna forma, quisiera plantear, yo creo que no es un solo reto, cuando menos identifico tres retos fundamentales. El primero es involucrar justamente a las comunidades, a los grupos indígenas en todo el proceso y la estrategia de Red Plus. Es fundamental el hacerlo, por eso nosotros impulsamos el que se hicieran varias consultas con especialistas, pero también con la población en general.
To answer the first three questions, and in like three segments, one regarding the communities and indigenous people, that's precisely what we try to do. I mean, there is still a lot of work to be done, but this reform process, we managed to accomplish it through a consultation process. No, we couldn't consult everyone, but at least we tried to do that.
El segundo reto es lograr que los beneficios los reciban los dueños de la tierra, los dueños del bosque, lo cual no resulta nada sencillo. Efectivamente, México tiene bastante avanzada una reforma agraria, pero no exime de que haya conflictos, de que se tenga que resolver el tema de la tenencia de la tierra.
The second is to assure that the economic benefits go to the owners of the land. In Mexico, we have very advanced agrarian reform laws that define the property rights over land, but that doesn't mean that there are not conflicts remain to be solved.
Y el tercer reto es adaptarlo a las condiciones y a las características de cada país, a lo que estamos viviendo, no solamente ambientalmente, sino legislativamente, políticamente, adaptarlo. Ese es un reto complejo.
Another challenge that has to be taken into account is that every country is different, and this international instrument had to be adapted to every country's realities, social, environmental, economical, political.
En lo que se refiere a si México y los países en desarrollo debemos de seguir recibiendo los apoyos, yo diría, no podemos solos. Efectivamente, México está haciendo esfuerzos importantes por dar resultados, por resolver, por atender. En la ley de cambio climático se establece claramente que debe haber un fondo para atender el tema de cambio climático, lo establece ya como por ley, pero somos un país en desarrollo. Tenemos todavía muchas necesidades, inclusive muchas comunidades pobres comunidades vulnerables, muchas de ellas viven en los bosques, con comunidades indígenas, que es necesario que pues seguir trabajando para que no estén en esas condiciones.
In regards to the question about the middle-income countries, she's saying that we cannot do it alone, no? That we still are a developing country, that the General Law on Climate Change establishes a climate change fund that will be used to fund precisely adaptation mitigation measures, but we cannot do it alone. We are a poor and developing country, and those people living in forests especially, so we do need the financial assistance from abroad.
Je veux répondre à quelques aspects des questions qui ont été soulevés. Si j'ai bien compris le premier intervenant, voudrait savoir quels sont les défis les plus importants pour la gouvernance.
So he's going to respond to some of the questions, and if he understood well, the first question was about what is the biggest governance-related challenge.
Pour le cas de la RDC, il y a des causes internes et des causes exogènes. Pour les causes internes, il y a des lois qui ne s'adaptent plus au contexte actuel, qu'il faut adapter. Il faut adapter ces lois-là au contexte actuel et prendre en compte toutes les conventions internationales auxquelles la RDC a adhéré et intégrer tout le processus inhérent à la réalisation de la RED+. Et parmi ces lois, il y a des lois récentes qui ont été prises récemment, comme la loi sur les principes fondamentaux sur l'environnement, sur la conservation de la nature, qui nécessite une harmonisation entre ces différentes lois pour régler le problème des juxtapositions entre les différentes lois.
I'll give it a try. So there are some internal and external causes. If we're talking about internal ones, then he was referring to the existing laws that are not adapted to the current context. There is international legislation today that is not yet integrated in the current legal framework. He was also referring to the environmental law and the law on the conservation of nature that needs to be harmonized in order to avoid superposition of these laws.
Un exemple concret, la loi foncière, qui est la loi la plus importante dans le cadre de RED, est élaborée avant la Constitution qui a été promulguée en 2002.
To give a concrete example, the land tenure law was created before.
Loi foncière, la Constitution a été promulguée en
2002. It was created before the Constitution.
Alors la loi foncière proclame que le sol et le sous-sol est la propriété exclusive et inaliénable de l'État.
So the law prescribes that the soil and everything underneath the soil belongs to the state.
Alors que la nouvelle Constitution parle de la souveraineté de l'État sur les ressources, il faut harmoniser.
And the current Constitution talks about the sovereignty of the state on the resources.
Un autre cas particulier pour la RDC, ce sont les conflits armés et les guerres à répétition provoquées par des pays voisins, appuyées par les puissances économiques et multinationales dans le but de piller les ressources naturelles de la RDC, et ça affaiblit, ça a un impact, un grand impact sur la gouvernance.
Another problem for the Democratic Republic of Congo are the armed conflicts and the wars, also driven by economic forces.
Bon, on va continuer le débat après entre nous.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le député. Please, Tina, very short.
Yes, very briefly. I think the first question by the colleague from Indonesia is that what is the most critical issue in RED governance? I would say it's tenure, and tenure. And this is land tenure, forest tenure, and RED carbon tenure. That without the clear tenure arrangements and ownership arrangements, there's no way to ensure that the payments and other benefits will trickle down to actually local and community level in an equitable and fair way. And that leads to that there was a specific question for me on the UN RED program that about the community rights and indigenous rights, asking whether the UN RED program can impose some conditionality to countries. Or my question would be no, the UN RED program, FAO, UNDP and UNEP cannot impose any conditionality to countries, but we do work with countries to support their capacity and in a participatory way to actually improve their legal frameworks, including to formalize the customary rights. And just briefly to Simone, yes, you are right that there is no actually RED payments yet. The RED is not yet there, but it would be a bit of unfair say that there is no funding for RED. There's close to $8 billion in arrangements between donors and institutions and recipient countries currently underway according to the voluntary RED Plus database under the RED Plus partnership. So there is funding for RED readiness. It is for RED readiness, capacity building, hopefully eventually yielding to actually RED payments. Thank you.
Thank you. Niels, please.
We have to be very brief now. To our colleague from Ghana, I agree with you personally. Legal drafting is too important to be the monopoly of lawyers. At least it's important that decision makers at all levels, they have the adequate information. And that is why that UFRO, the International Union of Forest Research Organization, tried to put together, building on all our knowledge, policy briefs like RED Plus, biodiversity and people. And there will be a session starting at 1:30, so we have to rush out to be ready for that in this room about this and this report here behind of that. So I will stop here.
Thank you, Niels. Barry, please, both some short answers and a draw-up of the session.
Yes, indeed. Look, first of all, Mohammed, I would echo what Tina has said, but I would put it in a slightly different context. She said tenure, tenure, tenure. I would say create confidence. And in order to create confidence, you have to have security of tenure. Mr. Pandey, failure of the market, yes, of course, there is. And that's why people are very skeptical about bringing a new market mechanism in to resolve what has been a most grotesque failure of the market to properly value the ecosystem services that forests provide in the first place. You talked about community skepticism, and again, I support what Tina said about conditionality. James, legal drafting. Look, there's an issue here. You talked about rigidity, and that's right. But there's a counter side to that. People need certainty from legislation. And all the time, you have to play that in tension. So yes, you don't want to be rigid, but you do want to give people certainty about what the law is, and that is all part of creating that security of tenure that gives people confidence that this is something they can trust and rely upon. So I would say lawyers are a necessary, but not a sufficient condition. I'll come back to Simone. Our colleague, Mr. Olungo from DRC. Absolutely, the needs of the autochthone, the needs of the indigenous people. If we do not start there, RED Plus will fail. RED Plus will fail if it doesn't start, be rooted and grounded, and in the end deliver to those people. And that's why what impressed me so much about the message that Niels gave, and I promise you we had not conferred before this meeting, but where it dovetailed so well, was when he said, including, and this is to put it in theoretical rather than political language, but he said, including socioeconomic objectives up front will increase likelihood of achieving biodiversity and conservation objectives. In other words, people first. If you don't put people first, you won't get the outcome, because you won't create the certainty that you need, you won't create the confidence in the system, because people are concerned about themselves, they're concerned about their children, they're concerned about their livelihoods, they're concerned about their economic development. That's how you get things done, by showing them. And that was why it was so absolutely important, what Maria Isabel said. And really fundamental to this is consultation. And it's not just about consultation. We had a very interesting discussion in our work yesterday, where we said, yes, consultation is absolutely essential. It is a precondition. But there is something more. There's something more than consultation. People have a right to be consulted. But perhaps they should also have a right to withhold consent. Not that they can veto the law in the country, but that they can say, in our village, in our forest, we do not want this law. By giving, and this is what in Mexico they did. This is what they did in Mexico, and that is why there was universal buy-in. Because they gave people the right of veto, the right to withhold consent. And the moment you give somebody the right to withhold consent, they say, why don't they want me to get this? Let me look more carefully here. There must be something good in it. It creates confidence. So, definitions also really important. When we're talking about the governance framework, absolutely important that from the point of view of drafting legislation, we get definitions right. And all that was being said by Santosa from Indonesia about harmonization, not working in silos, but working across government departments, making sure that we are integrating policy management. That's why the words that kept on coming again and again and again in every presentation were land use planning, spatial planning, customary laws, tenure, property rights, consultation, and implementation. Those were the words that every single one of the people who spoke today used. And the reason for that is they are what are vital to create this process, to create confidence in this process, and to ensure that it is not just a process about conservation and biodiversity, but it's a process of social improvement and economic progress. Simone. You know, the EU spent 200 years cutting down its own forests. Maybe that should tell you how much we should pay attention to them about what they're saying now.
Thank you, Barry, for this passionate and incisive resume of the discussions. And thank you for the keynote speakers, also for Niels and Tina, and very especially other parliamentarian panelists that have done really an excellent work, also for the translators, for all of you that will now have to hurry for lunch.